It's very interesting when you buy a house in the middle of winter, when everything is covered with snow, because you have no idea what the previous owner did landscaping wise. And so when spring comes, it's kind of an adventure to see what pops up. And even though we hadn't moved into the house yet, that first spring was fun. We'd make periodic trips up and walk the property to see what was popping up. And for the most part, we could identify things. Flowers that were planted here and there, sometimes seemingly random. Things that had been transported by squirrels or birds to random places in the yard. For the most part, we got it right. But there were some things that we weren't quite sure about. They looked promising, but they kind of looked like weeds too, so I just mowed them down. And they kept coming back. In fact, they seemed to really thrive. I consulted the neighbors, and they said, "Oh, I think they're pretty much just weeds. We have the same issue. I had to dig them up to get rid of them." Well, there was so much else going on at the house in those days that I wasn't about to take time to dig up quasi-weeds. And so I just kept mowing them down, and they kept coming back. You see, unless you get the roots, that's indeed what happens. Roots are interesting that way. They keep coming back, reminding us that they're there. And so it is with this season of Advent. We begin rooted in the promises of God, made to our ancestors. But this first Sunday of Advent is always a Sunday where we look to the future, to Christ coming again, to that promise. But it's also a somewhat dark prediction, because a lot of stuff has to happen, it seems, before he comes again. Wars, rumors of wars, prophets, false prophets, catastrophes, earthquakes, fires, floods. You name it, it's out there. Even pandemics and persecutions. Who knows what the future brings? But the picture painted is not pretty. Now, those of the first century thought Jesus was coming back tomorrow. And so, even in the midst of all of that stuff, it was easy to keep hope. But for us, now 2,000 years removed, those promises have faded. They've worn out. We've pretty much given up. Advent's kind of a prep for Christmas. More of a preparation for the coming of Santa Claus than for the coming of Christ. Because we've lost our roots. We think it's all about the future, when it's really all about the past and how God has established this relationship with us. It is very clear in the Hebrew Scriptures that God will be our God and we will be God's people. It's also clear that God remains faithful to that promise, despite our unfaithfulness. Even in the midst of all that goes wrong, all the stuff that we bring upon ourselves, God remains faithful. When God's people find themselves as prisoners and slaves in Egypt, he goes down and brings them out with a mighty arm and an outstretched hand. When they wander in the wilderness, he feeds them. When they find themselves in political turmoil, he promises to deliver them When they ignore the promises and try to fix things on their own and end up in exile, he goes and finds them and brings them home. Again and again and again, God comes for his people, his wayward people, for those lost sheep, those prodigal children, bringing them back home, giving them new life. It's in those promises that the promise of Jesus is rooted, of a faithful God who will continue to fulfill his promises. And Jesus is the ultimate promise, the restoration of paradise, of creation reborn, of healing and hope for this crazy humanity. But unless Jesus is rooted in the promises, we can make Jesus into whatever we want him to be. Everything from a militaristic, charismatic, quasi-superhero to a socialist do-gooder. But Jesus is far more than that. He is the restoration of all of God's promises. He is the hope of our life now and our life in the future. It is rooted in God's promises, and we should be able to see how these promises continue to unfold. As Jesus points out to those who gather around him, you're really good at reading the seasons of the year. Just look at the fig tree. You know when it blossoms, what season it is, and when it bears fruit, what season it is. And when it grows ripe, you know it's time to pick it. It's harvest time. If you're so good at reading the seasons, why can't you read the seasons of God? Have you lost your roots? Have you forgotten the stories? Have you forgotten what God has done in the past? This is a trustworthy God who will fulfill all his promises, even in the midst of our unfaithfulness. He will come and gather us home, giving us life and hope. Who knows what will grow out of us when God takes hold? We finally moved into the new house, and then it became pandemic time, and so we couldn't do much else but work. And so we began to investigate the yard a little more and decided, let's see what exactly is going on with those things that we kept mowing down. And so we dedicated a small patch of them and let them go. And did they ever go? They grew and grew and grew. A foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, some of them got. All summer long they grew. It was tempting to whack them down. They weren't the prettiest of things. But we had made a promise, and so we let them go. And about late August, early September, when everything else was starting to fade, they brought forth the most beautiful yellow flowers. They lasted all fall, brightening up that corner of the yard. Who knows what God is even now growing in this crazy vineyard that we live in? We will just have to watch and wait and see. Each winter as the year grows older, we each grow older too. The chill sets in a little colder, the verities we knew seem shaken and untrue. When race and class cry out for treason, when sirens call for war, they overshout the voice of reason and scream till we ignore all we held dear before. Yet I believe beyond believing that life can spring from death, that growth can flower from our grieving, that we can catch our breath and turn transfixed by faith. So even as the sun is turning to journey to the north, the living flame in secret burning can kindle on the earth and bring God's love to birth. O child of ecstasy and sorrows, O Prince of peace and pain, brighten today's world by tomorrow's, renew our lives again. Lord Jesus, come and reign.